Today on Comic-Jutsu, we are talking Jim Shooter. Was he Marvel's greatest editor-in-chief or its greatest failure? We'll discuss this and more on today's episode. Welcome back to Comic-Jutsu. I'm JT. Today I'm happy to be joined by my good buddy Super-K once again, and we're going to discuss the great editor, writer, and publisher of the comics industry, one James Charles Shooter, known to the rest of us as Jim Shooter. We're getting into an era where we might not even be allowed to say his name very much longer, unfortunately. Super-K, that's the state of the world that we're in for some reason because of, the connotations attached to that. I actually think about that when I go to make, posts like on social media. Today we're talking about Shooter. Come listen to us. It's like, no, Jim Shooter. It's comic books. People, calm down. But how are you today, man? Welcome back to Comic-Jutsu.
Glad to be here. Doing great. Looking forward to this. As you know, he wrote one of my favorite comic runs, and did so much. So I'm looking forward to going into Shooter's life and legacy.
As am I. I'm looking forward to talking to you. I was probably brought into comics by a different project of Shooters. There are so many things we can discuss when it comes to Jim Shooter. A lot of good, a lot of bad, some indifference. We're going to do our best to at least try to touch on the key points of Jim's history, and we'll also offer some insight from various interviews with Jim Shooter or statements from the artists or writers, I'm making up new words, writers or editors that he worked with. So this should be a lot of fun, because I don't know about you, let's talk about, our personal interaction first. Okay. Because I started reading comics during the Marvel era. I have the most vivid memories of being in school. In the morning we had to sit in the lunchroom for, the home period or whatever, or pre-home period, as it was, whatever it was called. And one of my friends at school, in elementary school, we're talking like third, fourth, fifth grade. This was probably the fourth grade, I guess. Was reading some Marvel comics at the time, and I had read a few. I would pick up G.I. Joe here and there, which was later a licensing deal that Shooter had a large part in crafting and guiding. And he was reading. I'll let you guess if one book he had were a couple books from the Marvel Universe series, okay, and the other books were something else in Marvel. I'll let you guess as to what books they might have been at that time.
Oh, I would go with Spider-Man.
Well, it had Spider-Man in it, so it was Secret Wars.
Ah, yes.
Yeah, Marvel Universe was a clue, because Secret Wars started kind of at the end of the first Marvel Universe, and then it was running for the beginning of the second Marvel Universe. So, but yeah, that's some pretty esoteric Marvel comic timing. But anyway, he had Secret Wars 1, 2, and 3. I remember this was the first day of school, back in this homeschool section in the lunch room. And I looked at it and I'm like, oh, I know who the X-Men are, because they were on Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends, right? They had like 2 or 3 episodes, which were really cool. That was when we got the Australian Wolverine, the first, how about a piece of fruit, eh? Yeah, he sticks his claw through like a pineapple and a papaya or something. And they had the Juggernaut, Cyclops, and the classic line that Professor X gives when he uses his mental powers on Juggernaut at the end, and he's like, "You are paralyzed." Me and a friend of mine, we always quote that when we use like imaginary telepathy on each other, and we say, "You are paralyzed." But yeah, there you go. That's a look into look into the geekdom of myself. But anyway, Jim Shooter played a big part in that, at least from, because of the guiding hand that he provided as an editor in chief at Marvel at the time. And that was the time when being editor in chief, meant something. They had a lot of say so in the guidance and the creation of the actual intellectual properties for Marvel. But you came into you first encountered Shooter at an earlier era of his comic books career, if I believe.
Yeah, actually mine was probably earlier in the 70s and much more during the editing part. I was the kind of kid who would pick up the 3 packs of comics at a drugstore or whatever, and I remember um, getting some with Fantastic Four and Spider-Man and Iron Man all during this time, and it was just that's really what hooked me on comics was that. Um, I didn't have a big idea of who Shooter was at the time. Obviously, it was more like just really enjoying um, the books a lot. I mean, we're talking like the names that I recognized out of that were like Ross Andrew on art, or um, Iron Man was George Tuska. So it was, earlier in the 70s, but then when I really
That
got
sounds like
into
right before the right at the end of, well, before Shooter took over. Like, so he would have, instituted the change that came after all of that, I think.
yeah, he would have. He was
Because he
right
came in and
then.
started clearing house.
Yeah,
He was firing people. He chased off a lot of names: Roy Thomas, Len Wein, Mike Carlin, eventually several others. He didn't chase off
yeah,
Mike Carlin. There was a whole alleged, career interaction with them where he promoted them and whatnot, and then eventually fired him. But anyway, that's part of the sordid history of. I didn't
yeah.
mean to cut you off, but I thought you'd actually read his Legion of Superheroes stuff earlier, in terms of his writing, because I had heard of the Korvac stuff, as like, this fabled Korvac saga of the Avengers, before I started reading the books. But outside of Secret Wars, I hadn't read anything Jim Shooter had written.
Probably as far as writing, yeah, I would say that just simply because I didn't really get into the Legion until the 90s. But
Oh, okay.
once I got into the Legion, I started going back in history and reading, and I'm sure we'll touch on it later. But he saw Jim was a DC fan in his youth, and he just really got frustrated. And then, at 13, he takes over Legion of Superheroes. So his writing there established so many things, and he created so many characters who just were wonderful, including Keith Giffen's most hated character, Karate Kid.
I
But
always loved the Karate Kid
I did
personally. I
too.
mean, I like the look of the costume, and I like the whole idea of it, like space karate or whatever.
Super martial arts. I mean, it's great the fact that he could find weakness anywhere. If he just probed, he could find it and use it. I thought it was great, and that was Shooter loved martial arts movies when he was a kid, and so he's like, "I'm gonna create this character." It was fantastic,
That's
and it
great.
it worked. Yeah, and then Giffen kills him, but
And they probably they had to have stolen that name for the movie. I mean, because it predated the Ralph Macchio film, by many years. Probably a decade or so.
oh yeah,
Yeah, I
yeah,
read a really good interview with Shooter. The interviewer was one Michael David Thomas. So I've got some juicy quotes from that where he talked to him, and Shooter, talked about his career, and he specifically asked him about writing the Legion of Superheroes at age 13. And Shooter says that his family needed the money, and at age 13, you can't get a job in a steel mill. So you can't get any kind of real job, maybe running newspapers. So I needed to make some money. Looks like these comics couldn't be that hard to do, especially since I had given up on comics when I was 8 years old and hadn't noticed them again until I had run across Marvel Comics. So, yeah, that's pretty nutty. He mentions that when he was trying to figure out how to write them, he studied a lot of Stan Lee comics. He said, if I could just learn to write like this Stan Lee guy, I could figure out how to write good comics. He says that the DC comics were not good. So he thought, well, if he could just, write Stan Lee style comics for DC, that would help them out. He says, I studied Stan Lee's comics and tried to figure out why they were better and wrote a story for DC using what I learned. This wasn't some kid playing. I had every intention of selling this thing. My experience told me that they seldom had sweeping changes from one issue to the next. I made sure not to change too much, but to try to do what they did, but better. Adventure Comics number 345 with the Legion, I thought their rocket-shaped clubhouse was idiotic, but I didn't change it. I drew layouts to go with the script because I didn't know how the script was supposed to look like. I drew the rocket ship bigger because I couldn't figure out how 25 of these people could fit into what was the size of a phone booth. So anyway, so he says he got a call from the editor and they said, we want you to write for us regularly. And he said they started giving him assignments and he worked his way through high school while he was writing for them the entire time. And he lived in Pittsburgh. They asked him to come to New York, spend time in the office, and he had to get his mother to okay the whole thing for him, to have a business trip to go to New York. That's so crazy. It's like a kid, it's like a kid's dream come true. I couldn't imagine when I was that age if I had written a story for Spider-Man and they're like, okay, we want you to come to New York now and write Spider-Man for us.
Oh no, I mean that was absolutely crazy, and it really tells a lot about Shooter that he was able to just, as a kid, he laid these things out. At 13 years old, he was doing layouts, and he would write his scripts like that. So you're looking at these layouts and you're Kurt Swan and you're going, all right, you know, because Kurt was doing a lot of the penciling back then for Legion, and yeah, I can't imagine, what it must have been like for him to get these layouts from this 13-year-old kid, but he worked with them, and you know, that's one thing that reading. I got a lot of my information out of the Legion Companion, published in 2003 by To Mars Publishing.
Okay.
Is put together by Glenn Cadigan, and he did a couple of interviews with Shooter on that. In fact, Shooter wrote the introduction to it, and one of the things he talked about was how he was, characterization was a strong point for him, but he came in when Mort Weisinger was the editor. And if you've ever read anything about Mort Weisinger, he was very hard on people and not very nice to a lot of people, according to the interviews I've read. But what Weisinger did was he helped Shooter get an idea of plot, and I think that's very important because as a writer, you've got to have both. You've got to be able to deal with plot and character. And some writers, it's a lot easier to do characters. Some writers, they have an easier time doing plot, but it definitely schooled him in that aspect of it while he came up with all these fantastic characters during that time.
That's interesting. And I think probably Mort Weisinger helped install a lot of that professionalism in him that he brought to his approach to comics, later as editor in chief at Marvel. I mean, this is just my guess because this is his first encounter with a real, editor type. He talks about Weisinger in the interview. He calls him an old-fashioned cigar-chomping editor who thinks it's his job to keep you under his thumb. He said he'd call me on regularly scheduled phone call and scream at me for 2 hours. So yeah, he wasn't one known for handing out love and emotional support, so to speak, allegedly. But it's interesting because when we talk about the good of Shooter's career, there are a few different points. As a writer, he had that run through the Avengers, which was a really neat story. I love those kind of cosmic big stories, the Korvac saga. And then he was responsible for the whole Secret Wars thing, where he came up with the basic plot of that, and of course orchestrated the licensing and everything. He also wrote a few of those first Marvel DC crossovers, or maybe it was just the Superman Spider-Man one, but I know he wrote that one, which was pretty interesting.
He did Batman and Hulk as well.
Oh, he did both of those? Okay, all right. Yeah, so I wasn't certain. I didn't pull out absolutely everything I had before we started recording, but I'm trying to remember like the high points. And for me, I would even say Starbrand, at least for part of it, was a high point. I mean, it was an attempt to do something different when they launched the new universe, And then, of course, later with the Valiant stuff, I forget which ones he was writing on Valiant. I know he was, he oversaw and kind of orchestrated everything, but he didn't script absolutely everything. It was just a few of the different properties here and there. But I do kind of categorize at least like that first year, maybe even 2 years of Valiant as being, a successful high point. I mean, because they created this entire universe by picking up these obscure Gold Key characters. They were obscure, but I had heard of them. Well, probably mainly because of my own exposure to things like the Encyclopedia of Superheroes at the time, which came out in 1985, which I reference every now and then because before the days of the internet, you didn't have any idea of how much of anything was out there. You had no idea how many comic books were in existence, how many superheroes had been created, how many supervillains, whatnot. And this book by Jeff Robin, who's an interesting character all of his own, I encourage you to check out his wiki. But anyway, he wrote this Encyclopedia of Superheroes, and there are a few of them. There's an Encyclopedia of Action Heroes, I think. I'm forgetting what the title is. And then there's one of Supervillains, which is the immediate companion book to this one. And then there's like the Action Adventure Heroes, and then one is Robots and Monsters and Aliens, and then I think there's like one more. But it categorized everything in whatever the subject matter was. It categorized it in this book and collected it, whether it was from a comic book, a movie, from radio, or from a novel, so it brought them all together in one place. And that's where I had heard of Magnus and Turok and Solar, the man of the atom, or doctor of the atom, whatever his tagline was at the time. So, who knew that those were ripe for, rebranding and repurposing for a new, to basically unify an entirely new universe and create something that for a very short time, it was at least close to being a number 3 behind Marvel and DC. I mean, it was this other separate superhero universe that people were interested in and wanted to follow the continuity of. And I think it was successful enough that it inspired a lot of copycats. Like all of a sudden, all these different companies, were trying to create their own superhero universes, quote unquote, whether it was Malibu or you had Dark Horse doing their various attempts at it or what have you, just all the way across the board. Yeah, it's not all Valiant, though. Valiant in conjunction with Image as well. I mean, there was a whole kind of zeitgeist that came out of that. But Shooter was the one responsible for bringing a lot of those Image guys in. They were able to take advantage of the incentives and things that he put in place as an editor. So anyway, just not to jump all over the place, but to at least kind of hit the high points of his various successes throughout his career, he also had a variety of failures. But I don't know. Was there anything else you wanted to say about the Legion of Superheroes? I know we have to kind of like keep things moving so we don't drag this out for a 4-hour episode, because then it would only get a listenership of 2 or 3. But
Yeah. I think the biggest thing is he wrote as long as he could, and he did some things. One thing that he did that was interesting was the fact that Pharaoh Lad, he of the Sun Eater saga, um, he was going to have that character as a black character, and Mort said no, no, we can't do that. And I remember him saying that, then later they created uh, Tyrock, and when they did that, the character was a lot more, uh, shall we say, stereotype. And so he felt bad about that, but um, he really made some changes that stuck, and then he was just like, you know, I get the feeling from interviews I read that he was just like he couldn't put up with Weisinger anymore.
he sounds like a difficult just person to deal with. But yeah, those old cigar chomping types are definitely, they were a different breed, to say the least. I don't know that I've ever read any of the actual shooter stories from that time period. I think all of my information on those stories comes from the DC Who's Who books, which were basically their version of the Marvel Universe stuff, where they listed all of the various superheroes and supervillains and told their histories and outlined their superpowers and that kind of stuff. I loved those as a kid, because you could get just kind of this condensed, 1-page summation of these complex histories and whatnot. And that was where I read about most of the Legion of Superheroes stuff.
I would recommend, as for anyone who wanted to just see a little bit about what he was about, um, read the Sun Eater saga, which um, introduced some characters, because basically there was like a 4-issue thing where you introduced some characters in a tryout. One of them was a traitor. Then suddenly the Legion had to work with some villains in order to stop the Sun Eater, and it really was quite an epic, and it was his defining uh, moment as a writer on Legion, I think.
The Sun Eater went on to be an enduring concept. Well, I mean, I was familiar with it because Morrison brought it back for, I think, part of their JLA run, and I think it made an appearance in All Star Superman. So, pretty cool concept there.
Definitely.
Then Shooter made his way over to Marvel, where he worked on the Avengers. He maybe bounced around and wrote a couple other things before he was moved up to being editor in chief. I think he had a short stint on Superman as well after he left Legion of Superheroes, but everything seemed to have kind of run its course then. And his Avengers work was pretty ambitious. I mean, he really brought that kind of cosmic scale to it, in talking about what he did with the Legion and having like the Sun Eater and that type of stuff. It's interesting. You start to see these parallels in things that he's created, like now that we're talking about it, from the Sun Eater, who obviously eats suns, to Korvac, who was like a danger to the entire universe, to Secret Wars, Korvac being the big cosmic baddie of that Avengers storyline. It's like, I forget the numbers, but it's like 168 through 170 something, maybe 163, 4. It's a pretty long run. It's like 12 or 13 issues. It went over the course of a good year. And then in Secret Wars, you have the Beyonder, who's potentially a threat to every, all of creation, not just the universe, but like everything. So he's good at those big concept ideas. That's one thing I liked about Shooter, just as a creator. He was definitely big at those high concepts for as at least as it pertained to superhero comics. Now, for all of his good, he did have some missteps as well. I think I forget the actual issue number. I couldn't go through and document every little step of this thing, but there's the issue, the infamous Avengers story where he has Yellow Jacket hit the Wasp. That was definitely a low point. I mentioned that I thought Starbrand was one of his high points in the new universe. And as a low point, I would just mention probably the rest of the new universe. I mean, out of that, DP7 was actually good, and the other one, I'm forgetting the name of it, Cyforce. I liked Cyforce. It had art by Mark Teixeira at the time, who was completely unknown, but his art was really solid, and it was a fun concept. And then DP7 was kind of like a different take on the whole mutant thing, so that was kind of an interesting thing. But the rest of the new universe was some real hackneyed stuff. But even before that, Secret Wars 1 was great. Secret Wars 2, not so great. Terrible from the beginning. And I mean, I can't even look at it now without thinking that the Beyonder in that is just like an XP for Shooter. He's like Shooter taking comic book form and going down into his creation. I mean, it's a strange thing to look at, and it's bad, and it was bad at the time, and it really annoyed me at the time, because I mentioned I came into comics because of Secret Wars. Little did I know, I mean, I came into it during, what I think is, definitely one of the greatest eras. I list the Shooter era as being number 2 behind the initial Marvel, Kirby Lee Ditko run. Then you have the Shooter era. And then third, Quesada. We're in that downtime period now where we're waiting for that next person. Hint, hint. There might be somebody on this podcast, Marvel, pay attention, who can take this thing back into making good comics. But that's a whole nother episode. But Secret Wars 2, yeah. And then the new universe was a bit of a dump there. But he did talk about the jump up to editor-in-chief, and he literally says, I inherited a train wreck. I started to call it a chain wreck. Yes, I inherited a train wreck. He says, I inherited a company that was going out of business and losing money. So this is Marvel in 1978. I know they had late books all the time. It was a period that was actually really good creatively. If you think about it, before Shooter took over, it was a good creative period. You had Steve Gerber on Howard the Duck. You had Tomb of Dracula was long running. Roy Thomas had got the license for Conan and Star Wars. He mentions that Star Wars has actually saved Marvel at the time. Otherwise, there would have been no Marvel in 1978. That if they had not had the money brought in from the Star Wars licensed comic, that Marvel would have gone out of business. So they also had, like, Jim Starlin was doing the whole Captain Marvel and Warlock stuff. That was all right before Shooter took over, so they had some really nice, classic books going on at the time. But a lot of things, had problems with being late. And one thing he mentions is that there was a problem with what he calls writer editors who were editing their own book that they were supposedly writing, and that he felt a lot of them were hacking. That's the literal term that he used for it, was hacking. Was he wanted to get rid of the writer editors because a lot of them were hacky. Yeah, I mean, it's funny. He says, going back to this interview with Michael Thomas, he says, it's funny now, I talk to people like Claremont. When I first sat down and talked to people like him, I'm saying story structure, identify your characters, introduce your characters and concepts, stuff he knew. The thing is, it's so easy when you're a creative person, and the check will keep coming, to just jerk off and do a sloppy job. For instance, there were writer-editors who were hacking. I got rid of the writer-editor thing. I made sure that everybody who had to have an Archie Goodwin everybody who wrote had to have an Archie Goodwin who made sure they had the stuff. Things like this don't make you wonderfully popular. So, so he came in and basically, told people to quit screwing around, make good comics. And he also, he focused on making them be on time. He brought that professionalism to it. And those are things I like to talk about. Like, I'm not so much trying to do this entire Jim Shooter, birthday tribute thing, though we're a little bit late for his birthday, but he did just have his posthumous birthday, which would have been September 27th, if we failed to mention that at the beginning of the show. But I do think it's important to look at, the mentality that he approached comics creation with. I mean, that comes from being an editor, that comes from also being an artist, that comes from also being a writer, and that you want to make a good product, but you also have to have a good package, good presentation. You have to be on time. You have to keep your commitments. There's that professional aspect. And those are things that, independent creators like myself and yourself, that we need to keep in mind, if we're dealing with those things where we have opportunities or deadlines or commitments or whatnot, that you want to keep those things if you want to keep creating work and whatnot. So it's interesting. There's a lot of good lessons to be taken there. Yes.
I think too, he did get rid of folks he thought couldn't really come together under his editorial purview. But he did a lot for creators at the same time that, as you said, someone who is a writer and an artist and editor, he looks at that like giving them incentives to stay on by, giving them a bonus depending on, how things sold. And of course, setting up life insurance and medical for them and royalties and getting their artwork returned to them. Those are important things.
Yes, I'm glad you brought those up. Those were definitely a lot of the advancements that he brought forward for Marvel, and we definitely need to make a point here to talk about it a little bit. People definitely do not give Jim Shooter enough credit for the good things that he brought to Marvel. You mentioned incentives, you mentioned health insurance. We talked about some of the story and production attitudes that he brought to it. But it's also important to mention that there's a weird bit of, I don't know if you want to call it good luck or synchronicity or whatnot, but there was also something called that you might be familiar with. You probably are, of course, but those of you out there that I'm referring to with when I say you may be familiar with the DC implosion of 1978, when DC had to cancel about 40% of their comics line. And because of this, there were a lot of comics creators and cartoonists that were suddenly unemployed. And Shooter was able to attract them over to Marvel by getting some of these things started, such as incentives. And I read in his interview that they basically had this incentive. The basic incentive was if you sold over 100,000 copies, you would get these incentives on these sales. And at the time that most Marvel books were selling about that much, which was pretty good. He even said that Dazzler, believe it or not, was selling 160,000 issues, copies an issue. I mean, that's pretty crazy to think about, because Dazzler was nuts. That's one I never quite got on board for, but man, boy, did Jim. He tried and tried. And maybe he was onto something for that, because Dazzler kind of predated like Jim and the Holograms kind of thing. That was a very Dazzler kind of thing. Now they're talking about bringing Dazzler potentially into one of these X-Men movies or Secret Wars or something, and the potential of having someone like Taylor Swift play Dazzler, that would be nuts. That would be
That
so.
would be.
That's just crazy to think about.
One thing talking about Dazzler is Dazzler #1 was the first direct market comic.
That's
And
right.
then again, that shooter.
That's right. I had forgotten that. That is a good kernel of knowledge. That's a good egg of knowledge to crack on our listeners out there, Super K. Well done. Yes. Dazzler was probably his first attempt to do that really kind of multimedia cross marketing, but he had other good attempts as well, because they did institute the Epic line pretty early on, which was an attempt to rectify missing out on what became the heavy metal license. The story goes that they were approached by the creators of Metal Erlant, who were looking to create, to crack the American publishing shores, and they passed on it, and instead Metal Erlant went on to the publishers of National Lampoon, and all of that became heavy metal. So after they saw how successful that was, Shooter was eventually able to argue for the creation of Epic, which was their more mature line of books. Mostly, I know the magazine stuff was mostly black and white, but I guess they did have a variety of just whatever goes. But aside from being like also for older readers, they also they offered either complete creator ownership or partial. I guess it kind of just depended on the various properties, but there were several popular ones that came out of it, like Dreadstar being the one that had the most longevity to come from the Epic imprint. And I'm sure there were a few others. I've got some. I know at one point Gru was part of Epic. They tried to get Frank Miller to do Ronin for Epic at the time. That's one thing we haven't mentioned yet, is that there are so many great creative teams. We talked about the great teams before Shooter took over, but then, the ones that he either put together or kept together or brought on, from Chris Claremont and John Byrne on the X-Men, to John Byrne on Fantastic Four, to Frank Miller on Daredevil, to Walt Simonson's run on Thor. The list just goes on and on and on. The Chris Claremont, Bill Sienkiewicz run on the New Mutants, Doug Monk and Bill Sienkiewicz on Moon Knight, Doug Monk and the various people on Master of Kung Fu. That was during his run with Mike Zeck or Paul Gulacy. Paul Gulacy might have been right before he took over, but definitely the Mike Zeck stuff. I'm sorry, you were saying?
I was thinking, wasn't the Iron Man run with Leighton, Michelini, and
Yes.
Romita Jr. was during that time as well.
Yes. One of my favorite runs. Yeah, absolutely. And Roger Stern on the Avengers, Roger Stern and John Byrne on Captain America. I mean, so many great artists and classic runs and classic storylines. It's interesting because some creators, there's a wide variety of opinions on Jim Shooter. Like, it's hard to say anything good about him because someone will feel like you're not saying enough bad things about him, and if you say something bad about him, someone will think you're not saying enough good things about him. I mean, so there really is a division of opinion on it. John Byrne, the one quote I'll definitely mention of John Byrne's was that he said all of these books weren't good because of Jim Shooter. They were good in spite of Jim Shooter. So John Byrne definitely had his list of grievances. There's a funny story that Jim Shooter talks about between John Byrne and Chris Claremont, that they had this strange rivalry where Chris Claremont would like use a Doctor Doom, for example, and he would put him in the X-Men. I think the actual storyline was Uncanny X-Men 145 through 147. And he had Doom in there teaming up with Arcade. And then Byrne, who was writing and drawing Fantastic Four at the exact same time, would then do a Doctor Doom story. And he would make it look like the Doom that was in the X-Men books was just a robot and not the real Doctor Doom kind of thing. So it was funny that they had this bizarro rivalry going on between them. I can't even imagine having to edit all of these creative people, because creative people are nuts to deal with. I mean,
Yeah.
we know from our time dealing with artists and other writers and whatnot, but then I spent, more than a decade dealing with all these filmmakers, and man, the egos are just, they can get so out of control, and it takes a big ego to kind of wrangle all these people into shape and into condition, and get them all marching in the same step. So it's kind of a thankless job. It's a hard one to do, and then if you do it, you're darned if you do and you're darned if you don't.
Yeah, I think one of the big things about that is, a creator works in their particular playground, say, for instance, and then when you've got to make it mesh into everything else and form a bigger picture, that's when it gets really, really hard. And some editors were not that good at keeping that together, and Shooter was a master of that.
Yeah, his list of accolades go on. One book I forget to mention that came out through the Epic imprint was also Elektra Assassin. It was selling a reported quarter million copies per issue. That actually kept the Epic line funded and running for quite a while. And because of Shooter, eventually artists were able to get their incentives and get a lot of their artwork back. He says that he put in the fight to help Kirby and Ditko. That he put in place contracts where creators could get like partial ownership and partial incentives for anything that they created in the books, and he tried to get it applied retroactively for Kirby and Ditko, and of course all those classic Marvel superheroes that created the universe, but that was all denied. And of course there are, epic, legendary articles and transcriptions of the court cases and the time that they spent in court battling various creators or getting involved in other court cases. There's a whole playlist of them, I believe, over on the Cartoonist Kayfabe channel, where they read the various transcriptions, like where Shooter where he was on the stand for, I forget which cases. There were some that had nothing to do with Marvel. Like he got involved in the Michael Fleischer case against Harlan Ellison and Fantagraphics, like that kind of thing, in addition to like all of the stuff where they were battling with whoever it was, Jack Kirby or Steve Gerber, or I think they had problems with Marv Wolfman and whatnot about the creation of Blade at one point. So just all kinds of stuff. So he tried to put those things in place. So they tried to have Epic, where they could do things like the Ronins, but they wound up losing Frank Miller over to DC. They tried to create the Star Comics imprint where they could have younger, comics for younger fans, so to speak. He does mention the only thing that he ever took that people might be mad about, the only plum he ever took, was Secret Wars, because he wanted the incentives for that, but then also he was already dealing with these bizarro egos in terms of creators, cross-writing themselves, like the Doctor Doom example, Chris Claremont and John Byrne. So what's the easiest way to solve that? We'll take all of them out of the equation. That way you don't have one of them writing and the other one complaining. You just have him do it, and then everyone can complain, so to speak. It's hard to pinpoint his downfall at Marvel. They, the failure of the new universe was definitely a part of it, but the new universe also seems like it was a bit sabotaged from the beginning. He talks about it was 2.5 years before the 25th anniversary, and the owners wanted to celebrate with something new, and he pitched the idea of, well, let's celebrate the anniversary and the creation of Marvel with the creation of an entirely new universe of superheroes. And he got it okayed, and he got the came up with the idea that would become the new universe, and he was given a developmental deal of $120,000 for 8 titles. And he set out to start making those. These titles would, of course, become books like Starbrand and DP7 and Cyforce and Night Mask and Justice. And I think Merc was one. And there were a couple others that were like really bad. But he says as he started putting the creative teams together, he got the call that they would have to decrease the budget to $80,000 instead of $120,000. And then he got another call that said they'd have to decrease it from $40,000. And then he got another call that said stop at $20,000. So he basically lost his entire budget for it. So there was no marketing beyond the initial push, which at the time was one of the lamest ads ever. It was just like a lightning bolt hitting a planet, and it says new universe, because one of the things I enjoyed about the shooter era, that 78 to, early 83, 85, maybe 85, as late as 85, was that they had the best in-house ads. They would grab these glorious, like Michael Golding covers from Micronauts and turn it into an ad, or they'd have, some kind of crazy Marshall Rogers Doctor Strange full page that they would turn into an ad, or the ones I remember most vividly, the Bill Sienkiewicz Power Man and Iron Fist ads and that kind of thing. They had these brilliant house ads, but by the time of 1986 and 87, when the new universe came around, you could tell there was no money for it because it just had this lame lightning bolt design, and it was not very good. I've heard in other interviews, I'll just paraphrase because I didn't go back and timestamp it or anything, but Shooter admitted on the stand, he said the new universe was our attempt to do the Dark Knight Returns correctly, was what he had called it. So by then I think his ego had gotten a little bit away from him, but he was also just dealing with all this crazy drama. He basically drove off John Byrne, who left to go do DC and Superman. And we talk a bit about that in our Every Day is Superman Day podcast, which you can listen to here on YouTube. And of course, it's your favorite podcast provider. But he was also, just a pariah because of all the various dramas that were going on in the halls of Marvel. He had fired several people over time, and they had a lot of crazy things going on. What I read the Vince Coletta exit interview, okay, and he talks about there was basically some drama and a push to get rid of Shooter to make room for, like, allegedly, like people like Tom DeFalco and whatnot, who DeFalco had moved up, that he had beef with Tom DeFalco and Mike Hobson and Bob Harris. So there was all this kind of bizarre backstage drama going on where they kind of took advantage of all that and used it to push Shooter out. And a lot of that drama, it was made possible because Marvel was going through a series of the company being bought and sold, so that sent them into just a long, turbulent period. So there are a lot of great books out there that detail these various time periods. Before we started recording, Super-K and we were talking about the comic book heroes, which is one of my favorite histories of comic books. I think it is probably the best history of modern comics, at least as it covers from the Silver Age to the present. It says the present, but it was published basically at the end of what we know as the Dark Age, or the quote unquote the Bronze Age of comics, which would have been 95, 96. So it perfectly covers two eras, that Silver Age and the Bronze Age era. So if you want the Golden Age history, you have to go to the Steranko's history of comic books. And that's a pretty good one. And then actually, for those people that are interested beyond that, I do recommend Jeff Klock's book, How to Read Superhero Comics and Why. Even though it's not presented as a history, it's a, this is why these books are. It continues to show the evolution of comic books beyond the Dark Age, but that's just my, that's my take on it. So, yeah, it's crazy stuff. It's hard to get all of this even into we could easily make this a 3-hour episode. It's impossible to get into 30 minutes and even 45 minutes. We've barely gotten to the new universe era of what happened with and to Jim Shooter, because he was ousted from there, and he had that one final glorious burst with his Valiant production. So, do you have anything to say on the end of the Shooter era there at Marvel? Got anything else you wanted to add?
Just that he was actually one of the parties that was interested in trying to buy Marvel. And then that's
Yes,
when Perlman bought Marvel, but Shooter had put his name in there, and I think a lot of people probably didn't like that, just simply because of what the feeling was about him at the time. Um, but for me as a fan, I would say that you know that worked out well for me because we got the Valiant universe, and I just absolutely loved the original Valiant universe as well as the reboot back in 2012. So um, I really, I think at that point in time, um, kind of a digression, but we had you were either if you liked Valiant, it was about the story and the writing. If you liked Image, it
Image.
was a lot more about the art.
It was. They kind of became the two perfect representations on that pyramid. If you have the little diagram and you have story over here and you have art over here, Images all the way in the art side, and then Valiant was all the way over in the on the writer side. Yeah, that's a perfect observation. So it's worth noting, Shooter, the when he attempted to buy Marvel was actually after he had been fired. So he spent the next year actually trying to put the investors together to buy Marvel. And it was during that time was when he met the Steve Masarski, who would end up becoming one of his partners for Valiant. And that led to Valiant. There was like a little project they worked on in between and whatnot. And yeah, and Valiant was fun. We've mentioned it a few times. I really love just kind of all of those early books because they really they focused on just telling the story well. And I think that's one of the that's another one of those kind of crafting points that Shooter would always make was just tell the story well. He would put the emphasis on like establishing shots or on medium shots in artwork, instead of the Image approach, which was the full flashy splash page where everything is big and dynamic and flashy. So he really focused on, I think his line was even just tell the story straightforward is what he called it. So
But
it's not as dynamic, but it made for great stories.
he pushed for a house style for Valiant, really, and I think you can tell it if you read the books. There is definitely a house style. You would when you pick up a Valiant book, it's a Valiant book just by looking at it.
Yes, the art on some books was better than others, like Solar Man of the Atom that featured Barry Windsor Smith. I thought was fantastic.
Yeah.
And then the art on most of the others, like Magnus, was never spectacular, but it was good. It was just good, solid artwork. And eventually, I guess after Shooter left, that's when they had people like Joe Quesada who showed up on books like Exo Man of War and things like that. So, but yeah, there was definitely a house style to it, and that was probably always the biggest drawback to Valiant. But if image and style over substance was not your thing, that's what made this a big attraction. I got into Valiant probably late because of it. I think the first Magnus issue I picked up was probably number 4, because I kept hearing about it. You would read about it in Wizard or eventually Hero Illustrated, something like that. And they're saying, well, this is good, that's good, this is good, that's good. And then they had those stupid price guides, which drive me nuts because they, manipulate the market basically. And all of a sudden you're looking at it and they're saying like, Magnus number 1 is worth $80 now. Really? It just came out, So you start paying a little bit more attention to it, because if you're a long time comic book geek, you do have in your mind sometimes that some of these books are worth something, and you're like, well, if I can get a hold of something that's worth some money and I can sell it for even more money, that's not necessarily a bad thing. I have done that a few times with my most successful, as a quick tangent, my most successful sale being Invincible number 1, because I buy a lot of first issues, and I had grabbed Invincible number 1 off the stand when it was first published, and I sold that for a lot of money. A lot of money. That was nice. So, but anyway, so he got Valiant up and running. And then there was some weird chicanery behind the scenes at Valiant, where the backers basically came to them after their first year and said, you have to go ahead and pay us back all of this now, that we're not going to be able to continue and let you pay this note over time, that like the total is due now. So we're going to end up just shutting you down. And to make a long story short, he was basically just ousted, and because he wasn't willing to give over like all ownership and all the creators' rights deals and all that kind of stuff. So he just wound up not signing the new contract that they wanted him to sign, and they used that as a reason to get rid of him, which was a shame, because his subsequent follow-ups after that, like Defiant comic books, was not as good. I mean, they had a couple. I mean, it's nowhere near as good as the early Valiant books. They had a couple interesting properties. Warriors of Plasm was not necessarily one of them, unless you just wanted to see something alien and goopy that looked like, I don't know it looks like some kind of combination of alien renaissance and a lot of mucus. So I'm not sure what the selling point was on that, but they did have a couple other properties like The Good Guys, which was like their attempt at creating like a team group of heroes. And that was kind of interesting. The art on it was just never really up to par where it needed to be, and the writing felt pedestrian at best, but it was the kernel of the idea behind some of those. Probably my favorite was The Dark Dimension, which was a co-creation of Steve Ditko's. He was supposed to draw it, but when the time came, he wasn't able to actually draw it, so he just kind of plotted it, But I don't know. Are you familiar with Dark Dimension at all? Did you ever see that one?
I saw it. It was not one I picked up.
It wasn't popular at all. The basic notion is that the Dark Dimension is like this negative universe that lives around us. It's like filled with these either demons or aliens or whatever they are, and they kind of latch on to people and fuel them with negative emotions, kind of thing. So I thought it was kind of cool in an existential, fantasy kind of way. It wasn't ever really harnessed into like a superhero concept, so to speak. It was just this guy who could go in and out of the Dark Dimension, so to speak, and he could see those aliens almost in like the John Carpenter's They Live kind of way, where he could see them and he could interact with them and destroy them and that kind of stuff, but everyone else was like oblivious to it. But the images, I thought some of them were really striking, where they would show these strange, alien demons, like, lashed onto people's heads and hanging on their backs and whatnot, and the person is completely oblivious to it. So again, the high concept is really cool, is a callback and a hallmark of pretty much everything that Jim Shooter touched over the years. It's worth mentioning that Marvel pretty much instantly got rid of their incentive programs and royalties and the health insurance and the, paid college for kids and all of those kind of programs that Shooter had helped institute. But reputation wise, he never recovered from not being able to get all of like Kirby and Ditko's art returned to them, or, get those guys retroactive ownership of their creations, which is unfortunate. And I will say, I don't know if you're familiar with the Super-K. I'm not going to name names, but I have read the names. as to why he might not have ever been able to give their art back, because it was sold. It was stolen and sold, okay? Allegedly, Bob Bierbaum bought this stuff. He used to talk about it on Facebook. I'm not going to name the names because you know exactly who it is, and everybody listening to this knows the names if I say them. But I will say, if you want to know, go to Bob Bierbaum's Facebook, and he tells you on there. The guy just passed away, God rest his soul. It's unfortunate because he was writing this kind of like tell-all memoir about his career of collecting comic books and original art and all this stuff. But he talked about buying pages, what pages they were, when and where and for how much, in hotel rooms from these artists and writer editors. So, we'll think about that, Super-K. If you want to know more, you'll have to write JT Streebo at viewer.mail.dojo@gmail.com. That's our new viewer mail email. So you can find it on the website. Wow, what a long, strange trip it has been for one Jim Shooter. Of course, he passed away here just how long ago was it? A couple months ago is when I started thinking that, we should put together this kind of tribute, and with it being close to his birthday here, it seemed like a good time to finally get this episode pushed out. He passed away on June 30th of this year, 2025. He had the successful but controversial run as editor-in-chief at Marvel Comics and launched comics publishers Valiant, Defiant, and Broadway. Broadway Comics, probably the less said, the better. Somehow he got the guy behind Saturday Night Live, Lorne Michaels, to back another comics brand for him, which was Broadway Comics. I've tried to read a few of those. They're impenetrably dull to me, so I don't know if you've ever even seen any of them, if you had any thoughts on Broadway Comics or not.
No, I'd never seen any. I'm more toward Shooter's later career. Of course, back in like around 2003 or so, he was writing Legion of Superheroes again for DC with the 3-boot Legion.
Okay.
The sad thing was the last issue of that book was issue 50, and the pseudonym of Just in Time was used for that last book.
Oh, really?
Yes. And so he did that. He tried to relaunch Acclaim in 2000 with another Unity series, which never was even finished. And then one of the last things he did later on was when Dark Horse had the Gold Key characters. He actually came back and started writing those Gold Key characters for Dark Horse.
Oh, I didn't even know that.
Yeah. So he had he kept going. He was not one to have his, keep his irons out of the fire. He was always doing something, successful or not. He stayed busy.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. I had no idea he had gone back to those Gold Key characters. We did forget to mention that Warriors of Plasm, the whole Defiant Comics thing, they were actually sued by Marvel for copyright infringement because Marvel had a character called Plasmer that was coming out at the same time. And basically because of that, Defiant Comics had to sink all of their money into battling Marvel. And it just, the company was never able to get off the ground. He said he had worked out a rights deal with Mattel, but because of Marvel, they weren't ever able to finalize the deal. So it's unfortunate. It's a shame, but he definitely left behind one of those great legacies. I mean, I immediately want to say like an unparalleled legacy as an editor, but there's so many other great examples of creators out there. But before we go, you dropped an Easter egg for old school fans when you said just in time. Like, people may not know, but Super-K and I actually, one of our first comic writing projects was for creator owned imprint idea that we had called Just in Time, which we got from our mentor, Rick Davis, owner of Funtime Comics in downtown Asheboro. Go by and visit them. Tell them that Comic-Jutsu sent you. But anyway, so we actually co-wrote Just in Time. That was a fun project on our part. Our approach to it was that it would be in 2 sections where I would write from the perspective of the father and Super-K would write from the perspective of the kids, and they were separated by time and space and trying to get back together. So it was kind of like a Lost in Space, but it was also lost in space and time through superheroes.
Those were good times. I enjoyed that project a lot.
It was a lot of fun. And it's a shame it never got to print. I hate that. I don't know who has the final pages for those, but if we ever find them, we'll have to try to piece it all together and put it out there for people. But anyway, it never would have been possible without Jim Shooter, believe it or not, because we wouldn't have been inspired to get into comics and reading comics and writing comics and creating comics. So there you go. Well, Super-K, we could go on for another 3 or 4 hours. We didn't even get to bust into any of the quotes. Maybe I'll put some of them up in the video just for the heck of it, and people can check them out there. But there's so much to talk about with the Jim Shooter era, the good, the bad. It was something, but it was pure comics. And I think if there's anything for us to take from it, it was just that it's good to just create good comics. You take the best artists, the best writers possible, you put them together, you let them make good comics, you focus on telling the story well, telling the story in a clearer fashion. You don't necessarily need to resort to tricks or things to attract your audience, just attract them with good, solid storytelling. The cautionary tale would be to try to learn to control your ego, and I guess you have to have your own Archie Goodwin out there, that acts as your overseer, that kind of keeps you in line and keeps you from getting out of control. But it's easier said than done. Do all of that and get it out on time. That's something us independent creators need to adhere to. Get the work done. Absolutely. And get it out on time.
You don't see as much of that now.
You do not. Get it out on time, much like this episode. This birthday tribute career retrospective of Jim Shooter, which will come out a week or so after his birthday. It's as close as we're going to make it, unfortunately. I guess he wouldn't be pleased, but hey, at least we're talking about you, Jim. Big guy, as they used to call you. Anyway, so there you go. From the good to the bad to the ugly. It was all Jim Shooter, and it's all comic books. Thanks again for joining me, Super-K. It's always good times talking to you.
My pleasure. Enjoyed it very much.
And thank you all out there for listening. Once again, make sure you are subscribed to Comic-Jutsu, whether that is on the YouTube channel, Comic-Jutsu, or through your favorite podcast provider. And of course, buy our comics when they come out on time, and they are available for you to buy if you're listening to this at some point in the future. Thank you all. This is Comic-Jutsu, and you have been listening to The Art of Comics.